Your arm being late doesn't necessarily mean your pec is tight, your subclavius is tight, your spine is tight. Can we see your T-spine rotation just for the camera?
You want him to get down on all fours?
Not too good right now, Ben.
You're gonna hurt him.
So I guess the first thing is let's cover why does mobility matter in the first place. Obviously Tyler Zombro, Matt Marsili, former tread athlete, current tread coach for the past few years. But specifically, you're a more tighter wound guy who's really dealt with this firsthand through your entire career. Again, you to some extent, lower half again a little bit tighter, upper half a little more mobile. I'm more of the hypermobile type guy, but we've all dealt with this on the coaching side. But just to start, like, why exactly does mobility matter in the pitch and delivery? Because a lot of the guys watching this are going to be more tighter wound guys, or they've been told that they're tighter and they need to do lots of stretching, lots of mobility stuff. And so, Matt, I wanted you to be on here just to be able to relate to them firsthand. So I guess just starting like with your story. Take us through like high school, college, that progression, and then when did you start to realize that mobility like kind of was a limiting factor for you, and how did that take you have a chance in pro baseball?
Yeah, so I guess for me, college and high school was a lot of powerlifting from the lifting standpoint, a lot of injuries, neglect of mobility work, and my movement compensations were as a result of all of that. Did not have much air on my shoulders. My back was severely compressed. I've had 5 surgeries at this point, so this movement quality overall was pretty bad. And then velo was in a decent spot in college, was in that 90 to 95 range, depending on a day or two. But I would say once I actually started doing some diligent mobility work to certain areas of my body, my spine, pec, a little bit of range of my hips, like I was actually see some progress from the throwing side. I was able to see the velo go from 90 to 95 to 93 to 97. It just felt a lot better overall, and just my movement quality was night and day compared to where it was a year ago.
So did you find that like you were just pretty much chasing max strength all through high school, through college, like trying to see how that would correlate to velo? Like you were the traditional, just like if I can add 100 pounds to my squat, I should be able to add X amount of velocity to my fastball.
Yeah, I mean that was from high school all the way through college. It was all right. Let's add another 100 pounds to my squat. Let's see how big and strong I can get to hopefully throw harder that way. And knowing what I know now, and knowing what a month and a half of some dedicated like power output lifting did, like that completely changed everything for me. And it's tough for me to go against it because I did throw harder every year in college. But I was able to see just a lot bigger jump, able to move a lot better, and just felt way better on the mound when it wasn't just straight force output.
Can you give us an idea of like some of the numbers just for guys watching this? Because like I think there's a perception where certainly to a point like adding force output will help.
Yep.
But then there's a point of like a guy gets to 85 and now they're squatting 400. They get to 91 or whatever, and they just think what got them there will get them to that next level. And like give us an idea like how much were you squatting? How much did you weigh, and like height, weight, some of these numbers in college, just to show like. I mean, you really maxed this out about as strong as a baseball player can get.
Yeah, so freshman year I squatted 400 pounds. Sophomore year I squatted 500 pounds. Broke my back my junior year and squatted 600 pounds my senior year. I could deadlift 600. I could bench 330. Like I was pretty maxed out on all the different scales.
5'10", 5'11", like 220.
I'll go 6 foot with cleats on.
6 foot 220.
6 foot 220,
Yeah.
And my weight has it's ranged from 195 to 225, trying to see like, can I throw as hard at 225 versus, 6 foot? And truth was like the bigger I was, the stronger I was, that wasn't the best for me to move on the mountain. This is where the sport's ultimately played.
So at what point, I know Zombro was your coach back at that point in time before you became a coach with Tread a few years ago. What was that moment like when he kind of explained to you, hey, we're going to try to trim down, going to try to drop down and get a little bit leaner, get down to 205, work on mobility, prioritize power output. Like, talk about that conversation. Maybe you can chime in here too.
Yeah.
And what was the buy-in like when you've been chasing strength for 8 years, and now he's like, no, we want to do the opposite. You're actually going to get a little bit weaker potentially. We're going to work on the mobility side.
Something had to change. Like we were just banging our head up against the wall. Like something had to change. So it was like, I was nearing the end of my career anyway. So it was like, all right, like I'm going to have to buy in. I'm going to have to try this stuff, to see can I make that jump to the next level. And ultimately, it kind of worked out.
Yeah, I think Marsili is a really good example of there can certainly be tight movers, right? we know that he's a very muscle-based, force-driven thrower, right? Like he's not relying on deep positions to apply force to the ball. But for me, with him, the tricky thing is when you do like a general assessment, is his relative anatomy doesn't allow a lot of range, right? Like it's not like, oh, if we just clean up soft tissue in the hip, we'll get 15 degrees of IR. It was never that. But I think Matt's a really good testament to, okay, we know the spine works in 3 planes: rotation, extension, lateral tilt, and ankles, knees, hips, etc. The fact that he just went through literally every single joint one by one to see, can I extract 2% from each? Because a guy like him who works extremely hard, he's going to maximize what he has. Like you now have to find the margins on the peripheral of like, where can we just gain? I knew ultimately if we could find, call it 5% more range of motion to apply force to the ball, the velo would uptick. But for him, it was super hard, and not many people are that diligent to break themselves down. And I'll give him credit to like let go of the identity of bigger, faster, stronger, and say, okay, I'm going to find more range. And if I can do that, I know that I'm very strong and I'm going to apply as much force to the ball as possible.
We touched on it there a little bit in terms of being able to apply force to the ball over a longer range of motion. But you also talked about where like certain guys keep trying to chase more and more and more mobility, as though, again, more strength is not always better. There's a point of diminishing returns. More mobility is not always better or realistic either. So maybe speak to that a little bit as far as like, should we be chasing like as much mobility? Like, should he be trying to get as much mobility as I have or as much mobility as you have? How do we determine like what is optimal? If a guy comes in, they're a tighter mover, they have limited T-spine rotation, they can't laterally flex their spine, they're limited in layback. It's like, are we trying to chase like Billy Wagner's layback? Are we trying to chase Tim Lincecum's separation? And how do we know like what should be the target for a certain guy?
I would just say on the hypermobile continuum, like I think about Trent Thornton, who has, I mean, I would never dedicate any strict mobility work to him because he's the loosest guy ever, right? And so for myself, I always had a hypermobile upper half, so I knew that I could really strengthen my pecs. I wasn't going to lose abduction. And so I think when you just look within the throw, we have to see, okay, how do these mobility things relate to the throw specifically, right? So if we know that we're coming out of the linear phase because of adductor tension, let's work on the adductors. If we don't get extension to help post tilt and layback, let's work on that. So I think being super precise on where you're looking at it in the throw, that helps athletes a ton too, right? Because we're not just doing mobility to do it. It's like this directly impacts this component of your throw, and this is why we're doing it.
Yeah, to build off that, you can look at the way someone throws, kind of identify like a mechanical flaw that could be driven back to a mobility flaw, out of the backside early, T-spine rotation, can't stay close, stuff like that, to where you can derive mobility work for that mechanical purpose, rather than just saying, you're doing mobility work to do mobility work. There should probably be like a thought and process behind it.
For sure. And I think also just like looking at the types of different pitchers that are successful at the highest level, or even like in our facility, like the guys that have some of the velocity records, like it's not always the loose movers. In a lot of cases, like you had our pull down record for a while, then Hunter Hoops comes along, breaks that, and he's a hypermobile guy. You're a very tight mover guy, pulling down 106. He comes in and pulls down 107 plus. Completely different ends of the spectrum.
Yep.
You look at a Justin Verlander example. You look at Brewster, Gratterall. Like you have tight movers at the highest level who can still be very, very effective. And so I think it comes down to recognizing like part of this is just undoing layers of dysfunction that you've added over the years. Like how much dysfunction did you add to your spine over 8 years of compressing your spine with, okay, it wasn't just 200-300 pounds. Like we're talking 400, 500, 600 pounds of compression day in, day out on your spine. That has consequences. Like your vertebrae literally thicken, the bone density increases, like you lose the ability to rotate, you lose the ability to flex, extend. Like how much of this dysfunction just from living everyday life in, flexed kyphotic posture, like sitting so much, hip flexors tighten up. Like part of this is just undoing the dysfunction that you've adopted over 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of just like living, lifting, training, sustaining knee surgeries, arm injuries. And so we're just trying to get you back to a baseline. It's not even like imagine like the 15-year-old you, what was your movement quality? The 22-year-old you, what was the movement quality?
Yeah.
You were a lot stronger, but the movement quality had diminished.
Yeah.
So how can we just get you back to a baseline, not necessarily try to get you to where Tim Lincecum was, just back to what your spine was naturally capable of moving in 3 planes, your hips were naturally capable of getting whatever range they had, and built layers of dysfunction on top of that.
Well, I think owning what your motor preference is also super important. Like different guys are going to profile out different ways. So trying to get them into something that they're not. You said like the Justin Verlander versus, a Trent Thornton. Like someone just took those blindly and tried to make Justin Verlander as mobile as Trent Thornton, like he's probably not going to be as good. Like guys have their motor preference for a reason, to where if we can keep them in it and also just improve off of what they're already really good at, I think that's also a really important part of being a good coach.
Yeah, I think also we started to talk about injuries, right? And we'll dive into this a little bit more, but I think another important factor is when you're assessing range of motion, is it joint, is it fascia? And then as you're looking at the throw specifically, is it a actual mechanical thing? Is it conscious or subconscious that a guy is avoiding a certain position? So I think that's something we should probably cover, right? Is bony anatomy versus tissue quality, fascial considerations, and then of course mechanical. Is it just a mechanical issue, or is their body staying away from a position?
Yeah, I do want to get into that in a little bit. I want to cover a couple things before that, before we dive into like the nitty gritty stuff. But I think it's worth mentioning just for people watching, like every issue is not just like stretch, or just like hammer tissue quality for an hour a day on this spot. Like some issues cannot be attacked just by stretching them. Some are protective in nature. Some are your inherent bony anatomy limiting you. Some are your body guarding you because there's an injury it's protecting against, or there's a compensation that built up from some injury in the past. But for people that maybe aren't as familiar with like how mobility works in the throw, like you've already alluded to, like being able to apply force over a longer range of motion, and how it's not necessarily more is better, but like to a certain extent, more is better. If you have no ability to get any layback at all, you have no ability to create any separation at all, it's like, what can you really do if you're already landing open and your arm's here and you can't get any layback? You're essentially only able to apply force to the ball over a very small range of motion. So what are the ways that we can apply more force over a longer range of motion? One of the ways is being able to stay in your back leg a little bit longer, which you guys worked on. Being able to actually be able to build linear momentum a little bit longer with a sustained linear move and not just like immediately come out of it. So that's one way. Like, do you have the range to even build a linear move, build linear momentum? Two, do you have the ability to actually convert that into rotation? So do you have any ability to like rotate through your hips and dissociate what the pelvis and the spine are doing? Or is this just locked up, moving as one part? So now when you can dissociate this, even just a little bit, even like the 20 degrees of separation or whatever that you can create, now there's at least a lag effect, and you can now apply force to the ball over a little bit more range of motion. Do you have the ability to actually keep the arm back in horizontal abduction and scap retraction? So if the arm is stuck here, like I can only apply force now from here to here. If I can now open this up, again, you might not get what I have or what Ben Joyce has, but you might be here instead of here. What's that worth? Well, now that's worth like an extra inch. You can apply force to the ball. Layback. If this is your layback and we can get you to 165, maybe not from 155. Maybe you never have 200 degrees like Hunter Hoops.
Yep.
But now you can apply that force over a longer range of motion in layback too. Lead leg. You looked at the lead leg. Like, what if you just have no ability to flex your hip? You have your hamstrings are super tight. It's like you're just releasing the ball up here. What's that worth to be able to hold on to the ball an extra couple inches there? And it goes back to that, like, can you steal like 2% from each, the hamstring, the torso, the pec, all these different areas come together. It's like you're never going to look like XYZ pitcher. You might look more like a Carson Fulmer, a Justin Verlander.
I think Matt's lower half in particular is a really good example of that, right? Because we know the knee surgeries, we know hip tightness, adductor stuff. And that was like one of the big velo breakthroughs was the back leg for him and creating a little bit of that rotational tension. And we talk about the crease in your shoe from when we were videoing back in DC. But that's a really good example. So Nevin speaks a lot about the foot turns the ankle, turns the knee, turns the hip, right? And so it's looking at that full line. Exactly.
Can you explain what you're talking about with the crease?
Yeah.
You're talking about getting on the inside of the back foot to wind some tension.
Yes. So for Matt, he lacks a substantial amount of IR, right?
Hip internal on the back
so
leg.
He's not going to be able to coil a ton into the back leg. While he is ER biased, we went after the vertical shin was a fad, right?
Matt, can you show us like your IR just to?
Is that good?
Yeah. That's a quick test that anybody can do.
You can test it, going in. And then also going out. Obviously, I have nothing going out.
It can be a balance point test and hip IR test.
Yeah. Well, interesting though, like I've actually seen some coaches have reached out to me and they're using some, like, I don't even know what the technology is called, but like some assessment thing, and they're like, it's like measuring their range of motion or whatever, and the guys are like doing this. And they're like telling me the guy has 75 degrees of IR, and I'm like, you're just tilting your pelvis.
Yeah, so just sit down and squeeze a ball between your legs.
If you are gonna do it standing, like, and just as a quick rule of thumb, like keep your pelvis level, and you'll get a pretty good gauge of what that total arc of hip internal versus hip external is, or sit on a box like we do foam roller between the knees, and you can test both legs at the same time, ER on both sides at a time.
Yeah, so with Matt, again, so I knew he was certainly more retroverted at his hips, so we had the ER bias. Vertical shin, again, was a fad. So for him, again, this is thinking about, you can think about it with the spine or anything, it's working in 3 planes, right? So if we're not maximizing, he's going to be really good in the sagittal plane applying force, but the rotational elements, he would go offset out, and that got a little extreme, right? And then as we went, like he's trying to hold adductor length, like it looked pretty good on video, but if you actually watched like that corkscrew element of the back foot, there was no quarter turn tension. And I remember literally just watching his shoe, and I'm like his shoe is not creasing, it's not moving, like we're getting no rotational tension on that tibia. And then in my mind, it's like, okay, well, if I tension that corkscrew at the foot, ankle, tibia's tension, is that going to help me unload the hip? And ultimately it did. So
yeah, this comes back to the how are you creating that vertical shin, right? Like I know we talked about this in other podcasts before, but we can also just reiterate what you're saying there, because basically what you're saying is like you were trying to sell out for that vertical shin by holding the knee back as hard as you can versus by loading and winding tension through the tibia, through the hip as you move forward. Could you maybe explain?
Well, I was also like, under the understanding of like, hey, if you're an ER guy, like you're gonna want vertical shin, foot out to steal some range of motion, hold that, and then go from there. And so like that's what I was trying to do, and it clearly was not working at all. And it's like what Z said. It's like no, I actually needed to use more of a IR bias to actually gain a little bit of tension to actually get the pelvis slightly kind of rotated so I could actually go, even though I don't set up that way to throw. Like I think that's where actually like high level coaching comes in, is like you're not gonna throw to every stereotype that you have. Like you need to be able to coach through different problems that athletes have. No one's gonna be the exact same. So like I wasn't like the systematic like, oh, like you're gonna be right here, you're gonna go down, you're gonna hold this and like huge adductor stretch. Like that wasn't it. Like I was actually completely different motion, but ended up working.
Yeah, I think also to the range of motion point, I know we've talked a little bit, especially in Matt's case, he's a really good example of the college guy who has lifted a lot, super heavy, and the compensations have come there. I also think about this from the back end with older major league clients who have been hurt, who have all these injury things that have happened, but also your fascial quality changes, right? So to the points of, let's say somehow, some way, he did create so much length through his back adductor. He creates that element through the linear phase, and he can clear it. Okay, well, how long into his professional career until that adductor doesn't hold like that? Is that at 28? Is that at 30, 32? So, like, you look at guys in their delivery, and this is why mobility, dictating where it's at in the throw, is so important. Is like, if I know that a guy generates good velo from like a super vertical shin, huge adductor length, I better be aware that he better maintain that quality for a very long time if he's going to keep that pattern and to throw hard, versus can you go find another solution that's maybe more of a middle ground to elicit high velocity.
Yeah, I think that particularly, and then also like that light bulb moment of like you can still try to wind tension through the back leg even if you're a tighter wrong guy. It doesn't have to be just like, oh, you don't have any IR, just try to hold the knee back. It can still be like, okay, I'm going to try to load into this thing and wind tension. You don't have much range, so it's still going to end up relatively vertical. Yep. But at least you're like, to your point, you weren't seeing any sort of like corkscrew or load into the backside because he wasn't trying to turn into that backside at all. He was just trying to hold it right here. So he had nothing. He wasn't ever winding the spring to have something to unwind.
I genuinely mean we were side viewing iPhone slow-mo, and I'm literally just videoing his foot. And you literally can't see his foot or his tibia move at all. Oh. Nothing.
Oh, it wasn't there.
Just straight.
I mean, I remember at one point like I had my toes pointed back to there, just because like I could drop and it felt so good, but it wasn't doing anything.
And for people that like, if somebody's watching and they're a little bit tighter mover, and like you do want to play with some of these different things, like it's easy enough to split test. It's easy enough to say like, okay, I'm going to throw 5 or 10. With my foot here, trying to hold my knee back, and I'm going to throw 5 or 10, foot a little bit more neutral, trying to load tension, maybe foot back, but still trying to load tension. And so you can split test these things pretty quickly, and that's what we'll do on the coaching side, and see like
Yeah.
very quickly what your body prefers and what the motor
The
preferences are.
vertical shin thing is it's an interesting topic in my opinion, because I talk to a lot of older guys now, right? And everybody in pro baseball plays golf. That's their big thing, right? And so we know in golf, like, you try to quarter turn into the back hip, but you also don't want a negative move to drift backwards. It's like semi-relatable to the throw, right? And so you talk to guys about their golf swing, how they're counter rotating into the back hip. It's like, okay, well, I have that rotational tension now, right? Okay, well, now if I set up like this, how much further do I have to go to get that tension? Which is an interesting thought, right? It's, okay, if I have limited IR and I want to access rotational tension, do I even want to offset, or do I like neutral? And so that's different for every guy. But to your point, like, split testing there is a huge thing.
Well, I think another important part too is, like, by me trying to load like that back foot, you would see my foot actually slip a little bit on the mound, which was essentially getting my foot turned out from an organic standpoint. I think Eugene Bleecker talks about that a lot, to where, like, that's not a bad thing. Like, by you on your leg, if the heel moves a little bit, like, you don't need this stable foot that never moves. Like, that's...
Yes, Curtis Taylor had a lot of modified mechanics. We did the thing with him when he went to Toronto, right? I have a video of him in Jacksonville throwing 99. I kid you not, you can see, so he's pretty neutral. As he goes down the mound, like, foot fully slips out, and it was 99.
That's a byproduct of him. Like, you can just tell he's loading tension from above, from the pelvis. That it's maybe creating a little more than you might want, but like a little bit of motion isn't necessarily.
And that so we're just talking like tibial rotation down there, right? But then you also look at a guy like Glasnow, who also has a supination pronation principle. So there's a lot of different ways that guys can help clear off the backside there.
Can you talk also about, like, getting in and out of positions? Because that's the other thing for people watching this that are a little bit tighter movers. What you typically see with that motor preference is, again, you don't have to wind into these crazy deep positions and then be able to get all the way out of them and get through crazy abduction and retraction and separation. Like, talk about, like, tempo, talk about getting in and out of positions, and like how you thought about that in your delivery.
I was always like the faster tempo down the mound. I knew I was always going to try and go as fast as possible down the mound. Me getting slow didn't work, because when I went slow, I would actually tend to get in deeper positions, knowing I couldn't actually do anything through those. So I was always like the faster tempo in and out positions as much as possible. So for me, it was, okay, like how fast can I go down the mound? I need slight rotation. I need, I'm going to need to drop a little bit. I'm going to need to be able to move through these positions as fast as possible. If I can't move through them, I can't go fast. And for me, I always had to go fast. That's why me pulling down, I could always pull down, because it actually cleaned everything up for me from a movement standpoint because of the tempo. So I knew that was super important on the mound. So the little stuff that I needed, which was super important, was, like, I needed the adductor to lengthen a little bit. I needed to rotate just a little bit. I needed the pec to lengthen, and I needed to be able to rotate. I needed the spine to be able to, for me, I was a big flex, extend, not as much rotation, but there'd be a little bit of rotation built in. Those were, like, the super important things to me, to where if I could clean those up and still keep those at a very fast tempo, that much really helped me and helped my career.
Before we get on to, like, some of the different ways that we might address mobility, and if it requires stretching, tissue work, joint mobilizations, I want to ask you about the idea of comps. And so, like, you can study, you can watch guys that throw at the big league level, but as a tighter mover, which a lot of the guys watching this are probably going to fall on the tighter mover category, like, how careful did you have to be with, like, who you tried to emulate or who you studied? And, like, what were some examples of guys that you felt did actually resonate with, like, your specific body type and motor preferences?
I remember going through TJ rehab when I was a senior in high school, watching DeGrom and Matt Harvey on the Mets, and, like, super smooth, clean, efficient stuff, to where, like that looks really good. Like, I wish, like, I'm gonna try and move like that. And I was just, like, absolutely beating my head up against the wall, like, not knowing. Like, I was 17 years old, didn't quite know that, but, like, a big one for me was, like, kind of trying to throw how Michael Kopech did. Bigger, tighter guy, has a little bit more mobility, but both big, strong guys. And I think that is where that started to resonate for me. And then Carson Fulmer, that was another one, like, smaller, quicker, more strong, like, on the stronger side of the spectrum. Like, those guys actually resonated a little bit more with me once I became a little more knowledgeable. But I've definitely gone through the rabbit hole of bad comp, not how you move, but that's just part of the learning process.
Yeah, I think to that point, especially for this purpose of this video, talking about mobility, I know a lot of guys here are going to be muscle-driven, tighter wound individuals, right? So one example out of my athlete group I always use is like Tanner Scott's back leg versus like Aaron Bummer, right? So Bummer's more twitchy, elastic, doesn't need a lot of deep positions versus Tanner. So in terms of the comps and looking at that, I know it's not perfect solution, but seeing if a guy is more tighter wound, bigger body, more strength based versus elastic, like there's no world that he should look at Jacob deGrom, right? Like,
Right.
They cannot be more polar opposite.
And that comes with like, are you force deficient or are you reactive deficient? Like, how do you produce your power? Like, are you just the brute force guy, the muscle driven guy, or are you the elastic springy guy? And also, I mean, there's a lot of things you have to look at when looking at if you're going to use like a high level thrower as your comp and try to study from them and emulate their timing or the rhythm or the leg lift or whatever. Like, you just have to be aware of like all these variables before you just say, I'm going to go. This is why everybody tried to throw like Tim Lincecum like 15 years ago.
Right.
And like it didn't, I mean, maybe it worked for like Trevor Bauer.
Right.
But like how many guys actually had the innate ingredients in their body?
Well, it's
to be
like
able to pull it off?
Aroldis Chapman,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like
another good
how
one.
many guys are that hypermobile and get that strong with that long of leverage?
How many guys can even get that strong, like in a realistic scenario?
Right. Yeah, like it that's the other thing. Lever length is a huge part of this, right?
Yep.
So you think about Chapman, you think about other long lever guys who are naturally going to get to slightly deeper positions because of lever
The
length.
timing of everything too. Like longer arms, you're going to need to break the hands a little bit earlier. You're going to get in deeper positions. You're going to need more time to get out of that.
Yeah.
Shorter limbs, tighter wound. Like you're going to probably need faster tempo, big drift, in and out of position super fast. Again, Carson Fulmer is like, that's who I think of when I think of how you throw.
Yep.
Is just like drift, drop, explode. Nothing else happens.
Yeah. Yeah, we sit here and talk about like the elements of him getting some rotational tension, but like we have to remember when he talks about moving his spine, it's like here to there, right? Like we're not buying a lot of range.
You're opening up a couple degrees of range at each segment versus like literally just stuck like a board beforehand.
Yeah. And that spine, I really want to hammer on the spine because we think of the spine so much as just working in one plane, as we've thought more and more about hip-shoulder separation being rotational driven, where we forget about lateral flexion and extension.
Yep.
So
Can we maybe like demonstrate a little bit like what we're talking about when we're talking about like spinal motion? Because I think during that forward move, you want to be relatively stacked position, right? You don't want to be early extension, but you also don't want to be like falling over backwards or forwards. During this linear move, we still want to be in that relatively stacked position, keeping the upper half loaded. It's really during that rotation phase that we need the ability to actually segment the spine from the pelvis. So that now we're tapping into that rotational capacity. And then as you can also see, depending on the view that you're looking at, as this rotates, there should be an element of side bend that happens too. That's the whole spinal engine concept. So there's rotation happening this way. There's also side bending that needs to happen. And then there's also, as that rotation works its way up the spine, there's a certain element of extension that needs to happen as well. So it's that three-dimensional unloading whip-like mechanism from the spine that like, again, the gross range of motion you have will be different, but some aspect of being able to segmentally transfer energy through rotation, lateral extension, or lateral flexion and extension is how you're able to create that whip-like mechanism versus like if you just land and rotate like a board, there's never any segmental energy transfer through the spine.
Yeah, and I think like for myself, someone that had a bulging disc, someone that broke my back, someone with 10 plus years of axial loading and training history, like my spine couldn't move at all. And it took me a while to figure out and come up with like a dedicated plan. And like Z said, like there's not just like one segment of the spine, like it's moving in 3 different planes of motion. So for me, it was like dedicated lateral flexion work, dedicated flexion extension, dedicated rotation. Like each one was just as important as the other. There's one that wasn't, more important than the other. Everyone thinks just rotation. Well, actually move more out of a flexion extension base. So like actually moving through those is probably slightly more important than say a bigger, looser moving range of motion, lower slot guy who needs more rotation. Like especially me being a high slot pronator, like I need to go through flexion, extension, and a little bit of tilt to be able to get into that plane. And I think, realizing that, I think really was eye-opening for me and just like buying more into what I needed to do, from the movement side.
Yeah, I think, well, so we'll get into the arsenal and how that corresponds to mobility things, but I think another huge fad a couple years ago, and we probably still see it with every pro organization, is you go to your spring training and you're getting assessed and they test T-spine rotation, right? Everybody does. And of course, generally your decel side is going to lack it. And then everybody's like, oh, well, if we can gain 10 more degrees of thoracic rotation left, we'll throw harder, we'll have better decel, whatever. Yeah, we wish that worked in that direct linear logic, but it doesn't always, right? And so going back to Matt's point of you assess him, right? He's going to be tight rotationally. And so then you realize, okay, we have to then go buy 2% extension out of his thoracic spine. We have to buy 2% of lateral tilt through his TL junction. And so if in my mind, I think of it in like almost percentages as I think about L1 to L5, T1 to T12, even some cervical components. But it's like, how much do we buy through each of those to create more range?
Yep. Can we see your T-spine rotation just for the camera?
You want him to get down on all fours?
Can we literally just like see? Because I want people to be able to see how we assess this and be able to like understand like, okay, this is like loose mover, who's gonna have like 75 plus degrees of rotation. Like, what are we talking about?
It's not too good right now, Ben. About right there. No.
That's off a hand.
And
Yeah,
and
let me go down.
Go for him on the ground and
Yeah.
just to see.
About right there.
And again, that's
You're gonna hurt him. Look at
again,
this.
that's significantly better than it used to be too.
Yeah.
So like we're kind of like splitting hairs a little bit, but like it really does start to matter when you talk about like what can you dynamically access in the
Right.
throw,
Yeah.
and is
Right.
there a layer of dysfunction built on top of this? If that's just how he's always moved since like 15 years old, he's had
Right.
that amount of range. That might be quote unquote optimal for his body. But if he used to have X amount and then all that loading, all those injuries, stress fracture in his spine, like all this stuff added up to like now he's like lost range at L3, L4. Now he's lost range at TL junction. He's lost all this dysfunction, scar tissue, muscle tone, everything is built up. It's like, can we at least get him back to baseline?
Yeah, it's crazy. I know we're going to go into injuries more, but I'm thinking about a specific case study. I'm not going to mention a name, who had a left oblique strain that went untreated for a while. It's a grade 3. And so you looked at him and he was super downhill at landing, right? And his slot had dropped significantly, which I was like, okay, you're not accessing the lateral tilt. We're just operating in the transverse plane. And you looked at his linear phase. The guy used to drive through in lateral tilt here, but because of exposing that front side oblique, he was driving downhill like this. So it's like, okay, again, this goes back to assessment-wise, looking at it as it corresponds to the delivery. I'm like, that the guy's spine can't laterally flex right, therefore he's downhill at landing now. Let's go attack it.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure we're not talking about the same guy, but I worked with a guy for like a week or two about 2 years ago. He came in for a week or two.
No, it's a different guy.
Different guy. But similar thing. So he used to be a 100-mile-an-hour guy. People would recognize the name. He used to have carry. He had a number of injuries. And yes, he was coming back from Tommy John surgery. His velo was way down. And what we actually found in our assessment was that it was actually a spinal lateral flexion issue. And so you look at, he was a righty, but you look at the glove side. He didn't have that ability to actually laterally flex here as he began to rotate to segment his spine. And so you actually look at that. He would completely fail our lateral flexion assessment. And that oblique was just completely bound up. It felt like he had another rib down here. It was just so tense. And he said it came from like a golf swing injury where he had just like over torqued that and never gotten it addressed. And so what happened? He went from that guy who was very linear, being able to get here and unload lateral flexion, really stay on the ball 100 miles an hour, like sitting upper 90s, to basically coil, unload, and then everything just rotated.
Right.
Like
He completely lost a plane of his spine.
He completely lost the lateral tilt side of it and went from 17, 18 inches of vert to 13, 14 inches of vert, from 99, 100 to 93, 94. And so it's one of those things that seems like a small deal when you just like, oh, what's the big deal? Like, I used to be able to do this. Now I can only do this. Like, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
The big deal is now there's a leak in the chain segmentally. We need to be able to transfer all this energy momentum from the ground through a linear move, through rotation, and the spine is that bridge between the lower half and between the arm, the upper half. And if that spine has a weak link somewhere in that chain that just like can't segmentally transfer, that's just a huge energy leak that happens.
For whatever reason, we just typically think about the spine in one plane of rotation, which is comical to me because I know we're going to get into arsenal mechanical things, but we even talk about a mechanical flag of like having a late arm, right? And so maybe it is a mechanical thing of being too trunk flex, whatever. But I think about so many guys, and this probably is a huge thing with him too, with gaining thoracic extension, is it's like, okay, so I'm here, right? arms in the same position, all of a sudden, if I have started to buy myself some extension, like now I'm on time. And you see those very small differences. Again, it could be mechanical, timing, segmental, but if it's also a glaring mobility thing, if you have no concept of what it looks like range of motion wise and you try to just attack it out of a drill set of plyos, who knows if you're going to get it done.
Yep. If a guy's flying open, or they're landing early, or they're not getting separation, or the arm's late, the trunk's too flexed at landing, like, you need to be able to, this is why we say, like, we need the assessment. If somebody just emails us in a video of their mechanics and is like, hey, what should I do? It's like, we can just throw a bunch of drills at you and maybe something works, maybe it doesn't, but you can't assume this is a skill-based or a motor pattern timing sequencing issue, because if now we see the movement screen on top of this, we know your strength numbers, we know your injury history, you can start to put all the pieces together and be like, okay, let's at least, okay, you're super flexed at landing. Let's at least, like, go check your T-spine extension screen and see, can you even do this? Okay, your arm's late. Let's at least check your ability to lay back and get scap retraction and see, like, okay, could some of these things explain what's going on here? Maybe you have perfect range of motion, like, on a table. Okay, this is probably a timing thing, a sequencing thing. We need to get you to feel the arm up on time. We need to feel back attention, feel the front side closed. But you can't just assume from looking at the mechanics that it isn't a mobility thing or that it is a mobility thing, because there's multiple factors that can be at play.
And I think going back to that in terms of multiple factors, it's all a big puzzle. Even the smallest injury components carry a ton of weight. So, like, I'll not mention the name, but a major leaguer who's had a ton of posterior sling injury history. So posterior sling, I'm going hammy, lat, obviously anterior would be adductor, obliques. And so in this case, this guy sprained his ankle playing basketball 3 years ago in an off season. And so again, lead leg ankle, this guy's elastic, impulsive. So he's a huge land from above, hover, land, impulse, shoot it through the hamstring. He's more extendy based, hamstring, glute, through TL junction to the lat, right? So we know that posterior sling transfer of energy, but you think about what happened with the ankle. And so then he had a later block. He was pulling harder through the hamstring, had a hamstring strain. Then that created some tension on the TL junction, and now it's to the lat. But if it's at the lat insertion, people will be like, oh, it's a shoulder thing. It's like, well, in reality, it probably stemmed from the ankle all to begin with.
That's why it's so important to know the injury history. Like, knowing Matt's training history, knowing that, you likely have some spinal compression, some discogenic type stuff, some disc-related pathology there. Like, now you actually have an idea of, like, what do we need to do to remedy this? Like, let's get rid of spinal loading. Like, let's substitute back squats for belt squats. Let's do more sled stuff. Let's do more power stuff. I know that was a big key for you too. Is like, just, you already had that force side of the equation, like 99th percentile. Like, you were as strong as any big league pitcher ever needs to be. Yeah. And it just became like, how can I apply force faster? How can I stop feeding into the dysfunction that I've been creating?
I think you can speak to how you don't lose strength. Because I remember we cut him off of, like, all lifting. Yeah. Like, it was like cold turkey. Like, I go sit and do Eldoas for an hour, Yeah. But then I remember we got you on just like a little bit of contrast to hit like a little bit of force stimulus. Yeah. And it was like day one at the old facility, he could shatter every record. Yeah. I don't remember how long that had been, but you can talk about the time there.
Yeah, I think a super common misconception is once you build that strength base, like, if you don't maintain it, you lose it. And that's just so completely false, to where once you do build that strength base, like, you're probably going to keep that for years and years down the road. You can do stuff to build on top of that. You can build that power base. You can do that stuff. That's why building that, the force base is so important first, because it takes a really long time to lose it. Like Z was saying, like, I went probably 5-6 months without, doing anything strength based, doing all Aldoa stuff, power output stuff, slightly worried that I may lose it. And we were screwing around, like, all right, let's just, like, check in. And, like, kids still squat 550 for 3 reps. Like, and I was like, this is just stupid. Like, I'm never going to lose it. And so I think just remembering, like, just because you transition away from that strength side training doesn't mean you're going to lose it at all. Like, you're always going to have it. And, that's why I always talk about, like, a lot of guys coming off, like, their affiliate season and stuff like that, where if we've built, like, that strength base in the past, like, we don't need to spend months and months rebuilding it. It's probably like a month check-in, hit like a volume or a strength phase. We're probably good to go. We can transition away from that, throughout the off season, but it's pretty tough to lose.
That comes back to the whole, like, muscle memory thing, which actually does have, like, a basis in exercise phys and myonuclei, and it's why it's so much easier to regain strength after the season. Like in the first month after the season,
Yeah.
you've like regained 6 months of like lost strength because it just comes back so fast once you've built it.
Yep.
And so I think that's something that like younger athletes that have never experienced that, haven't maybe built a strength base yet, don't kind of appreciate. But older athletes watching this,
Yeah.
like it's relatively easy to maintain. You can spend most of the off season more so just taking care of the body, power output type stuff, movement quality, again, working on learning new pitches, command, like other pitch design, other sides of the overall performance equation once you have built that strength base. But going back to just understanding like why a muscle might feel tight in the first place and all the different causes, we've kind of alluded to some of them, but maybe let's speak to a few of the things people can check. If they're told that like their hips are tight, or they're told their like spine is tight. Like to me, some of the main things I would want to check, we talked about posture. So we talked about how like it might not actually be like a tight muscle. It might be that your posture is just in a really bad spot. And so that's making a certain body part like feel tight. So like your hamstrings might feel tight. You feel like you have to stretch your hamstrings all the time. It might actually be that you're just in a super anteriorly tilted posture and it's just putting your hamstring on constant stretch and length. But your hamstrings aren't actually tight. You need to get your spine in a more neutral posture. It could actually be that there is an actual like tissue issue, like could be a fascial issue that would require soft tissue work, some sort of active mobility work. So that certainly could be a cause. It could be a muscle tone issue. So it could be that particular area is being overworked for some reason. You have to figure out exactly why that's happening. Like one easy example would be like, okay, flexor starting to feel like tight in season. Well, it's usually not your flexor is actually getting like quote unquote tight. It's that your flexor pronator is getting a little bit overworked. And so it's that muscle is toning up a little bit as kind of like a warning shot. It's like acting tight, it's feeling tight, but it's really just, it's fatigue and it's your body trying to guard and protect itself a little bit. Yeah. And so that isn't necessarily something you want to just like hammer an hour a day with soft tissue work and just keep going. That's actually a warning sign. Like, hey, let's maybe back off a little bit. Let's deload a little bit. Let's cut the throwing volume down a little bit pre-game, or let's like maybe not throw 50 pitches in the bullpen before going into the game. Like let's cut the workload a little bit. So sometimes it could actually be a muscle tone thing. If you have this experience of just like hammering something with tissue work over and over and over again, hour a day, and then like you've been doing this for 3 months and nothing's changed, it's almost certainly a tone thing. If it comes right back the next day, if it comes right back 15 minutes later, that's your body putting protective tension into a muscle. It's not actually a fundamental like fascial issue.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten much better. I know in our space, through all of us as coaches here, conversating on specific things to do in the weight room for guys, different fascial routines, mobility routines, because it's a good point of what is mechanical tension versus pure mobility tension. So I talked about posterior sling stuff, right? So then actually if I get in the weight room, can I get the guy in a position where he's fully elongated, contracted on the lead hammy, the lat is lengthened, and now put him through various things that are going to trigger that full sling. So I think we've gotten better at doing that because I think they go hand in hand, right? For whatever reason with Marsili, I always think about you alluded to this with a spine. We know he's compressed, so I think his spine is like a 4x4. But then if his erector groups running parallel to his spine are also very tight in tone, then like he's got like nails going down his 2x4. So I think you have to look at how those things are in conjunction there.
And the other piece that people miss, because it's more difficult to work on your own, is the joint side of it and the bony anatomy side of it. Mm-hmm. So like there are times where the low back is presenting as tight, your spinal erectors or your QLs, everything is just like locked up. Maybe you're having back spasms, quote unquote. Part of the answer might be like we do dry needles, you do tissue work, you try to relax the muscles that are tight. And maybe those muscles are tight or toned up, but there can always be like an underlying joint issue too. So you might need a chiropractor to come in and check the alignment of the vertebrae and like do an adjustment. Your neck is acting tight, these muscles are tight, maybe they are toned up, and maybe tissue work is part of the solution, but maybe you need an adjustment from a chiropractor, a PT, to actually get that alignment back in position. It goes back to like the position of the rib cage, position of the pelvis. It's like checking the actual position of the underlying joints can oftentimes be the actual underlying solution versus just looking at the muscles or the soft tissue, the fascia that goes on top of them. Again, that might be, soft tissue might be part of it, active stretching might be part of it, but making sure the underlying joints are actually in a good position. And I just think it's so underrated having like a quality PT, but specifically somebody who can do, or at least check the positions of the spine. Because there's 4 times a year, like I sleep in my neck wrong and I have something, and like it doesn't to go away from tissue work. Like you actually need an adjustment to like realign that vertebrae where it's giving you like different nerve symptoms. causing everything to spasm up. Like 6 times a year, like I go on a road trip or I'm on a plane ride, my low back tightens up, and like you need some minor adjustment of the actual underlying joint. Now the muscles can actually soften, loosen up, and that guarding, that tension that you feel is actually just guarding because there's an underlying joint imbalance.
And there's small things that add up to that. I keep thinking about Thornton because he's walking around like he just had his first child. And so he's been complaining about neck tightness on his left side, but like he's been holding the baby in his left arm, right? So you have to, I mean, you just think about it logically and go back through the steps, and you'll.
Well, you're actually a good example in your own career because you had the head injury, major concussive stuff. You're in a neck brace from that comebacker, and then what happened the very next year? You can speak to that. Like So have the brain injury, screws, plates. I'm stabilized in a neck brace. I have a ton of post brain surgery complications, right? But like one of the big things was like I did not want to move my neck, right? Because I've been in the brace, so like I'm rotating like super tight. I feel like Marsili moving, moving like a cinder block. But it's just like a protective mechanism. Like you don't want to move your head fast. Well, then from those complications, my scalenes had scar tissued. Then I started having vascular symptoms in my hand. I started having some nervy stuff in my hand. I knew my pec minor was probably fine, but the scalenes had gotten bad and scar tissued, which then led to other issues. But yes, to your point, it's like, especially within your neck as it affects the brachial plexus, you got to stay on top of that for neurogenic and vascular reasons. I know we're getting low on time, so a couple more things I want to touch on. I want to go through like each phase of the throw and just like generally talk about like what are like the 1 or 2 things that we look for where mobility can really play a factor at that phase of the throw. And then I want to get into some of the data stuff and arsenal development stuff for kind of the last 2 things we'll touch on. First, we go through the different phases of the throw. I mean, during the initial leg lift, the initial drift, like I think we can agree, like mobility isn't necessarily a huge component there. Like you're not really stressing or you're not pushing end ranges of motion really anywhere in that initial part. But during the linear move, like we already talked a little bit about the adductor, but what are some of the areas if somebody's having a hard time actually staying in their backside and riding their actual stride or linear move phase towards the target? Like what are 1 or 2 areas that you would, as a coach, check?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big ones of recent is actually abduction strength. Okay. I've been on a little abduction strength kick because people think about, yes, we need to lengthen the adductor, but like you also have to be really good in abduction, right? So
especially to be able to drift.
Exactly. That's a huge, and as guys get older, if they lose some adductor quality, they can't just lengthen easily, then, you got to see how they are abduction wise too.
So the strength, but the active component on the other side too.
Yes.
So like, let's say you're doing a mobilization here to open up that adductor, but also being able to like strengthen the other side, like being able to lift up as well.
Yep.
So that's one thing, abduction strength, adductor length, to be able to stay in that. And then I guess you would say hip IR would be the other part.
I mean, hip ER, like the hip's going to move through both of those throughout the throw. So I think both of those would be important, but I think like one thing that was like important for me was like me trying to gain hip IR wasn't just me doing like 90-90 hip IR stuff. It was like opening up the ankle, opening up the adductor, opening up muscles that help assist in hip IR to help me move through a little bit better without just cranking into hip IR.
We probably forgot to mention this, but in terms of looking at hip IR, ER, doing the prone test on the table, looking at IR versus the seated active test to see if it is more of a tissue restriction or bony anatomy. Because to the point, if you do it prone and you still don't have access to IR, then it's a bony anatomy thing. So like for him, doing 90-90 hip IR into oblivion is not going to help.
Yeah. And that was something like I was really like just bashing my head up against the wall with like I'm YouTubing all these hip IR stuff to like do to try and help, and just nothing's helping. And it was like, no, I actually need to, make adjustments at the adductor, the glute min, glute max, ankle stuff to help assist are going to help assist in the hip IR. Not actually going to show up on the table with, oh, I got 15 more degrees of hip IR, I'm moving way better. No, it's all these things that are assisting in it, which really, are going to help me move through the actual throw a little bit better.
And to a large extent, with hip rotation range of motion, there is a big genetic component, and that has to do with the actual retroversion, antiversion, so the actual like twisting in the femoral bone itself, and then also the orientation of the actual acetabular or the hip sockets. So if you have a more retroverted acetabular, more retroverted hip socket, and more retroversion through the actual femur itself, like you're going to be the guy that likes to squat out here, who likes sumo deadlifts, and guess what? You're gonna portray, you're gonna have a lot less IR when you actually.
And you have to know it. There's a tread athlete who is in AAA and a legitimate prospect who blew out both of his hip labrums through doing testing in spring training. But like if you knew his bony anatomy and
Yeah.
you know, underlying hip issues, you wouldn't put him in that situation.
And I think that's just something while we're on it for guys watching. Like if you might have limited IR, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should push. Don't ever push through pinch. Don't ever push through pain. Like if you're feeling a pinch, if you're feeling a pain, you're probably just grinding on your labrum. Like it's not, that's not normal. That's not what you should be trying to feel. Like some people justify, oh, you should. It's okay if it's a 4 out of 10, a 3 out of 10. That's okay. Like it shouldn't hurt. Like hip mobility work should not hurt. If you're doing like spinal extension stuff, you're doing like back bridges, like it shouldn't hurt. Like we've talked to guys who've gone and done like a bunch of back bridges, and like 3 out of 3 of them have had spinal stress fractures because they're just like extending into their low back and jamming on their facet joints. It's like that stuff shouldn't hurt. So if you're doing mobility stuff and you're trying to like brute force your way through it, and you're having pain, the next day it's more sore, later that day you're feeling a pinch, you're doing it wrong. Don't force it. You're probably butting up against like a mobility or a bony anatomy mobility constraint, where to Marsili's point, like can we steal a little more pronation range in the ankle? Can we steal a little more abduction?
Yeah.
How can we get that range elsewhere if we know this is an anatomical limit?
I think when you start thinking about anatomy and mobility with full body supination pronation principles, and like we just talked about linear phase, adductor and abduction, right? If you think about agonist, antagonist, and supination pronation, you realize then, like sometimes I need to just work on the inverse of things to free up X range to buy me 2%.
Right.
So exactly to your point of guys who are just trying to push through of one way on that continuum.
Yeah, for sure. So linear move, we've talked about a couple options there. What about rotation? So now we get to the point where hips unload, rotate into landing. What are we looking at?
For me, I like accessing. Are we getting more tibial rotation? Is it more femur driven? Is it pelvic driven? What is the main driver for the guy there? Because again, like in his case, I know it's not pure femur. His femur can't really do it. So how else are we going to access that rotation?
Right. Are they getting that? Is that back foot able to turn
Bingo.
over here, or is it just coming right up?
Are they everters or are they rotators? Yeah. I really like looking at it that way on the back foot function.
Everter would be more so the guy that, like Jordana Ventura example, where they're able to get to the inside of the foot.
DeGrom, good example.
That foot kind of compresses and then rolls over it, so they're able to stay in their backside a little bit longer before coming through. Rotators being more big toe.
Yep. That was like the old school ranch stuff way back with the distal to proximal rotation, where we just try to get to the pinky toe, which is great for back foot grounding and general rotational concepts. But then you realize not everybody's just a rotator off the back foot. There are guys who need more linear component of everting the back ankle. So, but I like looking at it from that full component.
Either way, though, like you either need the ankle to be able to move in pronation and eversion, or if you're going to do the rotating, you need that big toe to be able to extend to get there. Because otherwise, it's just like if this is all in like a big cast and it just comes through and doesn't move at all, then now you're just not segmenting at all and you're just coming off the backside a little bit early. So either way, you need, if you're going the big toe route or you're going the eversion route, you want some sort of ability to actually stay grounded in the backside as you go into rotation.
Yeah, I think spine-wise, you've already demoed it great in terms of lateral flexion that then transfers into rotation.
One thing too, like lateral flexion doesn't mean like dipping uphill. Lateral flexion actually means this is stacked here, and the pelvis actually unloads downhill, and so that pelvis unloading downhill creates a relative lateral flexion in the spine. It's not just dumping uphill to create that lateral flexion. So
paired with slight T-spine rotation, paired with lengthening of the pec as well too. Like there's a lot of things are going on to achieve like this really good position at flip up. Like there's a lot of things that are going to be required for that.
And we briefly alluded to it earlier, but like if you had a pitching coach like 2021 or whatever, when you're like at peak like tightness, like super strong, and they're just like telling you like relax the arm, relax the lower half, like you ultimately you're not going to be able to cue yourself through a major mobility restriction. Again, whatever the cause is it postural, is it actual tone, is it like a fascial issue? If you just think like relax the arm, but like you literally don't have, your body does not have the ability to relax that muscle because it's holding on to so much tension. It's holding on, like sometimes cues, like pitching coaches might get frustrated because the guy can't get into a position. Like why, I'm telling you to just relax your arm, why can't you do it? It's like no amount of cueing is going to get the 2021 Matt Marsili to be able to relax his arm, because like you literally had like your spine was a brick, your pec was a brick.
And some neurological stuff off injury history.
Right.
The guys are going to shy away from that because of it.
Okay. So T-spine rotation work, if they're missing, at least check, do you have the ability to rotate your T-spine? Do you have the ability to laterally flex your spine so that you can dissociate this way? Do you have the ability to extend your spine so that as that works its way through the spine can segmentally extend as well? And then through the upper half, do you have the ability to retract the scap and horizontally abduct that arm? What are tissues in the arm that you guys would check then if they don't have the ability to get back here? Like let's say they're just flipped up here or they're super late, don't have the ability to actually get retraction.
Yeah.
What tissues are you checking?
Obviously pec minor and pec major.
Pec minor.
And then the big thing for me is if a guy is generally hypermobile and he is getting back to deeper range, is he actually relatively strong in range, right? Like you think of a lot of young kids, younger on the anatomical scale, they're flying back there super deep in abduction. Do they kind of have the strength in that position?
For sure. It's kind of like the inverse option with the hypermobile guys. Like if you're a Aroldis Chapman, you're super mobile. It's why for him getting so strong was so helpful because he was getting ridiculous, Ben Joyce, ridiculous range of motion.
Hoops too.
Like do you have the ability to actually control and then fire out of that? Like length is great, but like length without strength is not that beneficial. It's like the loose rubber band that you just pull back, but there's nothing behind it. You want like a thick rubber band that you can also pull back as far as your anatomy will allow. That's how you ultimately shoot the rubber band as far as you can. So okay, so you pec minor, pec major. I would add to that subclavius. So just checking the tenderness underneath the clavicle. That's one that can stop the arm from getting back.
Lat and rhomboid.
Lat. So there's a whole host of tissues all around that shoulder girdle. That again, if any of these are, it doesn't have to necessarily be a fascial problem, but it could just be muscle tone. It could be like you're super just toned up from years of bench pressing and a month. I mean, you see it pretty quick. Like for you, it wasn't that long. A month of tissue work to actually get the brain to just relax and allow those muscles to actually relax a little bit. Now you can actually float the arm into deeper positions instead of just holding on to so much tension, having to fight these like this internal tug of war going on.
And then it was just buying that I'm going to take the same dedication, focus I had from the strength room to actual mobility, movement prep side of it, and that's where you actually start to see like the result. Like there needs to be that buy-in. Like it took me a very long time to get that buy-in, which is why I did not have results. Once I did, it was good.
All right, what about the block? We go into rotation from here. Our spine's working. What are the reasons guys maybe aren't able to get that block, or that knee starts to bow out, or that foot starts to bow out? They're just not getting a great block.
I like looking at the spine with a lot of this because if they've held lateral flexion, are they stacked at foot plant, and then is the trunk forward flex? Because for me, a lot of the block issues are if the trunk has already gone too far forward flex.
The trunk is already here at landing.
You're not going to block. You're going to be in the hip flexion, so you're not going to get it. Or if you do get it, it's just going to be knee extension as a false block. I like looking at the spine position on it.
Torso has to be kind of behind that front leg to actually be able to get the most out of that block.
So the positioning of the spine, if you're already way out over the front leg, like you might have the mobility in that lead leg, but it's not going to actually have the ability to access a good block. Like you're not going to be able to produce force backwards into the ground because you're already way too over the top. For me, I'm also just checking, like if I do think they're in an okay position, they should be able to block, but they're just like way too upright. I'm checking that lead hamstring. So I'm just trying to see, like, do they even have the ability to flex that lead hip? Do they have a hamstring issue? And then also that lead hip internal rotation. So do they have the ability to actually get around that lead hip? For a lot of tighter movers who don't have much hip internal rotation, striding crossbody can be a huge issue because you're just not going to have the range to do it. So if I stride over here, you can think of like Ryan Walker as a super extreme example. The only way to stride this crossbody and still get the pelvis through into landing is to have like this absurd amount of hip internal rotation. So I mean,
I think
what would happen if you try to stride that crossbody?
I'd probably blow a hip out. But I think the other big thing is like you look at guys where they land, especially more ER-based guys, where like their foot lands and the foot's actually a little this way. So that's just buying room for them to actually in the hip be able to pull slack out versus like, I've gone through the rabbit hole of kind of laying slightly closed and going, this is like, ow, this just like, it just hurts. So it's like your body's probably trying to figure out a way to compensate to get the most out of it.
Right, and Justin Verlander's a good example. Like again, like that back foot compensates a little bit, kind of turns out a little bit, but for him, you watch some of his throws that he's actually landing like 5 degrees open. But again, he's buying room to be able to still, and he still has, we'd all agree, has a great lead leg block. One of the best lead leg blocks, and he's doing that without a ton of rotation. But if somebody were to go to Verlander and be like, I want you to stride more closed, or I want you to just keep that front foot, see his landing a little open, let's get that front foot like 25 degrees closed.
Yeah, that's
You'd ruin Verlander. He'd blow out his front, he'd blow out his lead hip, or what would happen is his body would try to distribute that force differently, and so that would roll out, knee would roll out, knee would buckle. Like, you would basically just ruin how he's designed to throw.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, though, as we continue to think about the delivery and the three planes of motion. So if you aren't going to access a lot of the rotational components of the block, you better be good sagittal, right? And so I think thinking about it in that tone makes a lot of sense to me.
What about the arm acceleration phase? So we talked about the block, we talked about rotating to landing. What about the actual pull into ball release? So let's say a guy is really not demonstrating any layback, or he's getting like really pushy into ball release. He's not getting that like deep pull, unwinding full layback into ball release. Like, what are some of the ability issues you guys look for in terms of, are they able to get full layback?
And that's the corruption window.
Yeah.
Explain it.
So Brock Stewart, best example, TJ rehab phenomenon, right? Like, how many guys, we've gotten a lot better with TJ rehabs. It's not just 45 feet, 2 sets of 30 throws. But you see those guys, I remember just watching, and they're going full step and throw. Like, they're not consolidating out of a drill. And as they go, right, like, they don't want to relax and lay back and then rotate to ball release and accept any form of valgus stress. They want to shy away from it, which makes sense, right? So they're just going to land. How many people, the Adam video of him and his TJ rehab, right? Like, pretty sure his hand stays in front of his elbow the whole time. Like, it's the biggest push ever. So with that, as you see the push, what are ways then that we can constrain and work backwards to help them get some of that, right? So go ahead, hey, your first however many throws of the day in TJ rehab start out of a lasso. So you're just here, relax, rotate, throw. Okay, now let's do a figure eight into that, right? Now maybe we can add something else. But thinking about that too from the element of, we have, yes, shoulder ER, we also have post tilt, we also have thoracic extension. So when you frame it like that for guys, they understand, okay, I'm not accepting ER. Now can I accept ER and post tilt? Now can I accept ER, post tilt, and thoracic extension? And then obviously that sets up the acceleration phase.
Yep. It's such a huge point, because you look at when a guy's like velocity or like things start to decline, and almost always you can trace it back to like a specific moment. And many times that moment is they have an injury, and during the rehab process, that's where some compensation builds in. And so it's so frequently it's like elbow injury, rehab, and then they progress too fast in the rehab, or no one's paying attention to like their mechanics when they're throwing the first week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And so like they're told to throw out of a shuffle day one of throwing. It's like, what are we doing? So like, it's like, okay, day one I'm going to 60 feet, but my trainer's also telling me to get my feet moving and throw out of a shuffle. So what happens? Well, how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to basically go like, I'm going to shuffle my feet. I'm going to do one of these, because I'm basically going to teach myself to sink into my front leg. I'm going to teach myself to push the ball, because why are we giving ourselves momentum? Our body wants to throw 80, and then we're telling ourselves, nope, throw 40. And so what happens? You develop these like very pushy paths. You build all these bad habits, and then you look at, I mean, we could name names, but like you look at big leaguer through 99, comes back throwing 95. Big leaguer through 97, comes back from TJ throwing 94. And it can be traced back to the rehab process and not knowing what you're looking for, and the corruption window as
exactly. I think, and also for whatever reason, the element of pushiness, seeing the ball backspin, is big in rehab, because they know they're not throwing hard, so they think if they're flushing it that it's good. I saw somebody saying like throw eyes closed, which to me I'm like, I wish every rehabber would do that for like the first 2 weeks. Throw into the net, close your eyes, feel loose, whippy, whatever, because you don't want them to worry about the spin. You want the arm to accept some form of deeper-ish positions and just unwind. And so I think as you're throwing to a partner who's 45 feet away, exactly to your point, what are you going to do? You're going to find a way to throw slow, and then you're going to backspin it and think that it's good.
Right. So yeah, that's the other point as we go into like the final couple parts of the delivery, is some mobility issues, or you're not demonstrating full layback, or you're not getting full separation, or your trunk is opening early. It doesn't always mean it's a mobility issue either. Like it could just be a timing issue, guarding. Like your arm being late doesn't necessarily mean your pec is tight, your subclavius is tight, your spine is tight. It doesn't mean you shouldn't check those in the mobility screen, but like you might find it's great in the mobility screen. So for me in high school, like I had terrible issues in my, like I wasn't, you would watch me throw, like I land open, no tension. I wouldn't get full layback because I was landing so open. It wasn't that I didn't have the mobility. I had the mobility, great mobility. It's just like my timing was terrible, and so I wasn't actually demonstrating any of that potential usable range of motion in my throw itself. Final one would be the decel. So we get into layback, we've gotten that pull from behind the body, our arms accepted that valgus torque, we've unwound. Now we get into the actual deceleration path. What are you guys looking for to be able to get a clean decel? And this kind of goes hand in hand with the block phase too. But what are you looking for to make sure the arm can unwind?
Yes. So I mean, you have like the forearm pronation, scap protraction, shoulder internal rotation. You have the rotation of the spine too. So all those things are kind of going into like the decel part of the arm from a mobility standpoint. You trace all those things back to something there.
For sure. If you're seeing guys that just like really slam the arm, like they don't get that any sort of reach there.
Like, I think making a note of that, like a recoil is not always the worst thing in the world either. I think that's like, everyone wants to see this long, slow. It's actually like, no, like rotator cuff actually does not actually love that.
Especially guys who rotate in tight windows.
Yes.
I liked your demo the other day. So I think it was actually it was a good example.
Well, we can put it up on the podcast for people to see. The one with the rope.
Yeah, I wish we could make you do that right now.
We can. I agree with that. Like the recoil isn't necessarily bad as far as like being able to get the pelvis to decel.
Yeah.
But if the arm itself just like T-Rexes here, it's usually a sign the guy doesn't have internal rotation. It doesn't have the ability to actually turn over the arm and then recoil. So it's more like if you see the guys just like chicken winging, they like don't have any internal rotation to actually get the arm out front.
Yeah.
And the other piece, like one of my big league guys rehabbing from shoulder capsule surgery right now, he's in such an extended posture, and so he actually doesn't have the ability to get like out front and decel properly.
Right.
So he's basically just like throwing from here.
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating, but like for him, we're actually working on getting his rib cage in a little bit more neutral position so that he can give his arm more room to actually decel out in front of his body, as opposed to being stuck in that extended posture that he can't actually.
Yeah.
You can think of like the Max Scherzer exaggerated like finish.
Yes.
But like you do want some ability to get back to from extension back to flexion in the upper back to actually deliver the arm and have space for the arm to decel out here.
Good example on Scherzer too, because going probably what we'll talk about with supinators and pronators as well, is you think about guys like Scherzer who's actually going to pronate the changeup, right? So we talked about going into layback, we need abduction, you need ER, post tilt, extension, and then we're inverting that the other way. And so to that point, if you're a guy who's relied on pronation of a changeup, like Jarris had a labrum thing and he lost his changeup, well, all of a sudden you lose some form of forearm pronation, shoulder IR, protraction of the scap, flexion of the spine, whatever it is. Now you've lost the ability to do that. Your arsenal is going to be different, and you're going to have to find another way to get it done.
For sure.
Final thing, I know this is your favorite part.
Yeah.
Let's talk about north-south tilters, east-west rotators.
Yeah.
So what are you looking for? Again, we're talking about all the different motor preferences, tighter wound guys, but when you're looking at the actual like north-south versus east-west guys, what do you look for in terms of like the different mobility requirements for that guy to be successful?
Yeah. So we'll just start with like the general pronator versus supinator bucket, right? So we know generally what range of motion, fascial things, muscles correspond to pronation versus supination. So you can think about that being bicep, tricep driven. You can think about it being pec pull. You can think lat supinate. There are ways you can tie that together from the physiological standpoint. And then tilter rotator is how they're going to use their spine, right? So like the best way that I can explain that on the surface as we look at it, I'll just also say the buckets are supinator, pronator, elastic, inelastic, tilter, rotator. So if I look at a plot, so we've talked a lot about going from anatomy, physiology to how that impacts your biomech profile, the arsenal, let's figure it out, which you can do. You can design that a million ways. But when you're working backwards on the other side, you kind of have this notion in your head of what you're looking at, right? So if I look at a plot and the guy has 20 vert, 2 inches of horizontal, he's got a gyro slider, really slow curveball that has a lot of depth, I'm like, okay, high slot pronator, right? So within that, I know within his delivery that we're going to need to move better in the frontal plane. He's not a rotator. So
because for a guy to be a high slot guy up here, to actually deliver the ball from the high slot, they need the ability to laterally tilt the spine to actually get there, because otherwise they're going to get there by just turning
Yes.
and climbing the arm to get there. They need a really great spine in lateral tilt to be able to deliver that arm in plane from a high slide.
And I think if you don't know these things, for especially big leaguers who are making a living off of this, I'll use Colin Poche as an example. Unique thrower, tons of extension, tilter, and he's kind of pushy, right? If you just have him throw a one-off mocap, you're going to say, bad hip-shoulder separation. And there are teams out there who like say you have to have more hip-shoulder separation, but you create that in different ways. So if I'm not thinking, okay, he's a tilter, it's a north-south arsenal, I know he doesn't create separation this way. It's this way. So that's defining to me, we're operating more so in the frontal plane. Now, if I see a guy who's living on the zero vert line going big east-west, I know he's operating more on this plane. And then, of course, you have your hybrids, like we'll say, as we've been discussing the whole time, about using all planes.
The east-west guys maybe don't require as much of that lateral tilt. But they are going to have to rely on really good ability to rotate, just pure rotation.
Yep.
They don't necessarily get into as much frontal plane to deliver the arm.
And it's thinking about the delivery like that from the mobility standpoint and how the spine moves, how the pelvis needs to be positioned, etc. You find yourself adding in things in the arsenal to get guys to move better. I talked about this with Jason Adam. Like JA adding the gyro was simply to get him. So when he went big, seam shift change up sweeper, naturally he's going to operate more like this, which is kind of like a lot of organizations who go heavy
just
sweeper.
trying to chase as much sweep as he could on that pitch.
Exactly.
Dropping down a little
So
bit.
now I know that's the compensation. Okay, how do I get him back to, let's call it more lateral plane elements of his throw? Get him a little more tilty. Okay, well, let's add this gyro. Because
just feel a little
exactly.
more through it.
Because now in his head, what does the gyro do? The gyro's here. The gyro doesn't do this. So now he operates better in that plane. But you can use the arsenal components to really work back to try to extract some of these mechanical and we'll call it mobility-based things that put them in a better spot within the throw.
Yeah, you can also just use cues as well. So maybe they're trying, in their mind, they're trying to create a sweeper that moves this way, but their arm slot is actually up here. And so like Ben Heller is a good example. It's like we don't need to chase 22 inches of sweep on a sweeper. The 15-inch one that moves more this shape, still great. And it keeps you in your keeps you in your arm slot, keeps you in your trunk posture, and that actually like plays with everything else better.
I feel like I feel like when you're talking about the cheating and getting wide and casting, I feel like I have said tornado down a narrow hallway like a million times over the last year and a half, because, and this I reference this a lot, is if we gave every single guy a whirly ball and we said we're all going to try to make the ball move left as much as possible, all of us in general are going to access more of that transverse plane elements of the throw. All of us are going to counter rotate. We're going to land with the arm later. We're going to try to spin wide to try to make the ball go left. So we have to understand that, right? Because now lateral tilt's gone in our throw. We're only accessing that transverse plane. Is that best for us? Probably not for the vast majority of the population.
And I think to kind of tie this all together to end, because I know we've run over a little bit on time, I think for me, the biggest takeaway here is like at 15, I didn't know any of this stuff. At like 18, I still didn't know any of this stuff. Like you start to learn it by like the end of college maybe, but like my biggest takeaway is like get an assessment. Like it doesn't matter who it is, as far as like if they have experience having assessed players before, knowing what to look for mechanically, knowing what to look from a mobility standpoint, like get assessed so you have an idea what is going on. That area that feels tight might actually be a joint restriction. It might be fascial, it might be muscle tone issue or guarding from a previous injury. Like it's difficult to just give people blanket recommendations on a podcast like this because there's so many individual things that could be going on. So like the biggest takeaway I would say is get assessed from somebody who knows what they're doing. And then the second thing is like we'll add links under this podcast as well with like some different mobility routines and some different things. Like we've talked about the adductor, we've talked about gaining external rotation and layback and opening up the pec. Like we have various routines that we posted before. We posted some of like your adductor routine that you did as part of your transformation, some of the spinal stuff you did. So we'll put links under this in the description just so people can go through and like see some examples of what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, getting assessed is what's actually going to determine if you know what the underlying cause is. Now you can actually attack it, because it might be your pronator is toned up because you're doing too much, and if we just try to hammer soft tissue, it's going to actually make the problem worse. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, not really. I would just say, to your point of getting assessed too, is like with every decision you make from anatomy and physiology, we'll call that the mobility continuum, to the mechanical of your biomech profile, to your data arsenal construction, and then also looking at that backwards, is being conscious of, okay, what things am I changing? Why am I changing them? What does it do? Like, if you can't walk through that 3-step ladder and know exactly what you're targeting, you probably don't have a very direct plan in place.
I think also remembering what you're good at already is also a very important thing, not taking away what someone's already good at just to fit some continuum that you're trying to mold. Like, I think that where a lot of people get in trouble as well.
The better you can understand your body, your motor preferences, what arsenal fits best with that, what mechanical comps or cues fit best with that. Like, it's about learning yourself and learning what your strengths are. And then from there, you can actually construct a plan that makes the most sense moving forward.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
Drop a comment down below if you guys have any questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, you kept this up.
Yeah, I know. Well, Foley over there slamming a damn med ball the whole time.
Why don't you take the chest hair?
You got chest hair?
I do. I trimmed it.